you have to understand something, that these different species have different levels of potency. It really increases the abuse potential and the addiction potential. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get right to it. Today's topic is going to be what is ephedrine, or what is ephedra, or what is Sudafed. Now, this is couched in a greater series that I've been doing about stimulants, and in particular amphetamines. It's supposed to have been done by now, but I keep lagging over and over and over and taking delays. I started out with an introductory video, then I moved into what is GAT, and from there I went into what is FLACA, and I went from that to what are bath salts. And now here we are coming back to it full circle, starting the same series. Now here we're coming back to it and answering the question, what is ephedra? Each video stands on its own. I'd go back and watch those. I think once you finish this whole series, and hopefully I stick to it at this point, you're gonna have a really good handle on a lot of this stuff in a different way than most do. And there's not going to be any more magical thinking or guessing or trying to figure out what's going on with a lot of these substances. Let's get started. What is ephedra? And the second part of this title is, I hope to convince you in an interesting, fun way in some senses, that the mother of all modern 20th century amphetamines and methamphetamines, and eventually the new synthetic psychoactive substances, those scary designer drugs, the mother of all of these is an old Chinese shrub. Let's see if I can partially convince you of this in some senses. What is ephedra? Ephedra is the name for Mao Hung. Now, Mao Hung is a Chinese shrub. It literally means hemp yellow. And the literature shows, or historical artifacts show, that this stuff goes back 5,000 years of use in China. Ephedra or Mao Hung, whatever you want to call it. Goes back for 5,000 years for use in China. And active ingredient in this stuff is called ephedrine, okay? Ephedrine is the active ingredient in ephedra, which in Chinese is Mao Hung, and Mao Hung is a shrub, which literally means hemp yellow. And historical artifact, literature, shown that this stuff has been used in China for over 5,000 years for medicinal purposes, okay? Ephedrine is the active ingredient in ephedra, and it's usually called an alkaloid. That's what they refer to the active ingredient that has physiological effect in some sort of a natural product. What is an alkaloid? Pretty complicated. It's an organic base that's quite complicated, has a nitrogenous group in it, okay? And it's the part of that material, organic material, the plant, that induces the physiological effect. In the case of the things that we generally talk about, the psychotropic effect, okay, or the psychostimulatory effect, okay, or the sedating effect, or the euphoric effect, whatever you want to call it, however you want to call it. How do we know about this stuff? How do we know this stuff goes back to 5,000 years in China and it has medicinal purposes? Well, one of the ways that we know about it is a manuscript, medicine manuscript, pharmacology manuscript, 16th century Chinese, okay? And in that manuscript, it describes Mao Hung, or ephedra, and it talks about its use going back for 5,000 years. And it describes it as a diaphoretic. That means it makes you sweat, okay? Antipyretic. Tylenol is an antipyretic. That means it breaks fevers, okay? Circulatory stimulant, okay? I suppose what they really mean when they say circulatory stimulant, obviously it means it helps circulation, but it maintains blood pressure, probably made the blood pressure go up. And an antitussive, what's an antitussive? It's cough medication, okay? So we know this is how MORPHINE or ephedra was used in the Chinese mainland, and documents show us that this goes back 5,000 years. Around that same time where this manuscript appeared, 15th, 16th century, they were importing this stuff to Japan for the same medicinal purposes, okay? 200-300 years, late 1880s, a brilliant Japanese chemist, I believe his name was Nagai, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, he isolated the active ingredient, which again is called an alkaloid. For example, in opium, one of the most potent alkaloids is morphine, okay? So in this case, the active ingredient that is very potent and has a psychostimulatory effect is ephedrine. This was isolated and described in the 1880s, I believe, by a Japanese chemist named Nagai. Has a little bit of a history after that in Japan, but for the most part, it was forgotten till the early 20th century where it was picked up again. We're going to come right back to this. Let's continue describing the plant. Now, these have species, and the species of this plant are on many different continents. It's been discovered in Greece. It's been discovered in Russia. It's been discovered in the Americas, okay? You have to understand something, that these different species have different levels of potency, okay? Which means that they have different amounts by percentage of the alkaloid ephedrine, okay? That's really important to understand, okay? In India, again, manuscripts tell us that this stuff, the Indian species, which is quite potent, which means it has a lot of the alkaloid, and the alkaloid is ephedrine, and an analogy to ephedrine is morphine. The alkaloid is ephedrine. This was used religious ceremonies, and it was actually used for its euphoric effect. Interestingly, in that region, this was mixed with alcohol. So I don't know if they were really getting a high off the alcohol or the ephedrine, okay? It's really, I wouldn't know, and I don't know if anybody does know. In the Americas, it had other interesting uses. I guess North America had some funny vernacular. Mormon tea, whorehouse tea, and it was utilized for a couple of things, probably as a sexual stimulant. Also, it was used in a topical form to, I guess, either fight off or protect against things like gonorrhea and syphilis. How effective it was, I don't know, but that's how it was used. So, various species all over the world, okay? Different degrees of potency, okay? The Chinese name is MORPHINE. The English verbiage is ephedra. The active stimulatory psychotropic effect comes from ephedrine, the alkaloid, and different species across the world have different levels of potency, which means they have different amounts of the alkaloid ephedrine, okay? Let's talk a little bit about the action, and then we'll get into more detail about the action. Why does this stuff work? Well, because it rapidly crosses the blood-brain barrier. That means it really easily gets into the central nervous system, okay? And when it does that, it has this stimulatory effect. This is important to understand. When something rapidly crosses the blood-brain barrier, Let me give you an analogy which some of you might understand. Xanax rapidly crosses the blood-brain barrier. It really increases the abuse potential and the addiction potential. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Well, this stuff, ephedrine, does rapidly cross the blood-brain barrier, one. Number two, the brain has, anatomists and neurophysiologists, they break the brain up in different architectural areas and different conceptual areas. One of those conceptual constructs is the limbic system, which is a series of different structures located about the same place. And this area and those structures in the brain, they regulate emotional and behavioral responses, memory, motivation, learning, and they're highly concentrated in these areas. And a lot of these structures have to do with fight or flight responses and survival. If you know anything about substance abuse and addiction, these are some of the most important areas that are looked at by researchers and scholars to be able to describe and give attributes to in terms of what substance abuse is as a model and as a disease. Keep that in mind. Let's keep moving forward with this. As we move forward and describe what happened to this stuff historically, and right now we are in the 1880s, first described brilliant Japanese chemist by the name of Nagai, and he isolated the alkaloid, ephedrine, and he described it, okay? Let's pause there for a second, take a little detour into the nervous system, and let's give some anatomical and very basic conceptual constructs of the nervous system. You have the central nervous system, and I'm not going to get into details here, but central nervous system, let's just call it the brain or whatever. And then you have the peripheral nervous system, right? Your nervous system extends all throughout your body. Within that peripheral nervous system, you have what's called the autonomic nervous system, automatic. It works by itself without your conscious effort, okay? It innervates every organ in the body and all of the lining of places in your body like the gut, gastrointestinal tract, and so forth. So it's an automatic part of the peripheral nervous system, and we call it the autonomic nervous system, okay? It controls body processes, okay? Blood pressure, heart rate, rate of breathing, sweating. All of this happens without conscious effort, okay? The autonomic nervous system, it supplies the internal organs, and it also, blood vessels, all of that stuff. So the autonomic nervous system has two main divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic, okay? And what does the sympathetic nervous system do? Increase the heart rate, increase the force of contraction of the heart, gives you more muscle strength, releases stored energy from places like the liver, increases metabolic rate, causes sweaty palms. So that's pretty much kind of, you get the idea. The parasympathetic nervous system, okay, so now we're on the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, I just described. Parasympathetic, it stimulates the digestive tract, slows the heart rate, reduces blood pressure, and these also have sexual functions. For example, the parasympathetic controls erections. So after the autonomic nervous system, with its two divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, receives information outside external stimuli, okay? And it gives the body some information about the external environment. It usually uses either the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic, usually we think of it as stimulating, and the parasympathetic as inhibitory, okay? And these work together to regulate body processes, okay? And one great example we always think about, for example, the sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight. The sympathetic nervous system, the activating one, okay, prepares the body for stressful emergency situations, okay, increases the heart rate, contractility, widens the pupils, opens up your airways. Keep that in mind. Opens up your airways, right? So you can get more breaths in, okay? The parasympathetic division controls the body during normal situations, okay? It helps you go poop, digestive tract, eliminates weights, conserves energy. Now, these two systems work again together in concert, and they have two chemical messengers, okay? Neurotransmitters, okay? The two neurotransmitters, one of them is acetylcholine. The other one is norepinephrine or noradrenaline, depending on which side of the continent you're from, okay? Remember epinephrine, adrenaline, you see it in movies, they take a needle and a syringe and put it in someone's heart and they come back to life, which we don't do. But epinephrine, it's basically a chemical messenger, and but we're gonna get to that. Now, keep everything I just said in mind, and let's go back to this norepinephrine, noradrenaline thing, okay? Dopamine, everyone knows about dopamine. You guys all think of it as the stuff that has to do with stimulants. People often talk about it with opiates, which opiates do release dopamine in the central nervous system, but stimulants release much more dopamine in the central nervous system, okay? Norepinephrine is another one, okay? Epinephrine, obviously, another one. We think of these as physiologically active neurotransmitters, and they're called catecholamines, okay? Here's the interesting thing. They're also hormones, okay? They're neurotransmitters and they're hormones. For example, dopamine, right, which is a catecholamine, which is a neurotransmitter, also has an effect on the renal artery, and it constricts the artery going to the kidneys. So you might be in the ER or in the ICU. All of you are thinking of dopamine as the stuff in the brain that's released, and it can cause psychosis, but it's also used to maintain blood pressure. And if you have kidney disease, it can really have a profound impact on your kidneys. Okay, so we got up to the 1880s. A Japanese guy by the name of Nagai first isolated and described ephedrine, the alkaloid or active ingredient in ephedra, which is also called maoheng in Chinese, which has been used for medicinal purposes in the mainland for over 5,000 years. We got to there. Then we took a little detour and we described some basic divisions of the nervous system. We said central nervous system. Then we talked about peripheral nervous system. Within the peripheral nervous system, we described the autonomic nervous system. Automatic goes on its own. You don't even think about it. There's no volition involved. There's no consciousness involved. And we broke that down into sympathetic and parasympathetic. And we also described the two main chemical messengers there, acetylcholine and norepinephrine or noradrenaline. And then from there, we went to describe catecholamines, okay? And said dopamine is one, norepinephrine is another one, epinephrine obviously is another one. This is where we're at. What happened after the 1880s? Okay, we're up to the 1880s. And like I said, the Japanese chemist Nagai isolated the pure form of ephedrine, which is the active alkaloid in ephedra, maoheng, and described it. Now, let me say something else, and this is a great opportunity. When he did that, he was able to isolate 4 different forms of the pure form ephedrine. And you should be asking, what the heck are you talking about, Dr. B? It's a chemical structure, and how's there 4 different forms of the chemical structure? Well, there is. And he was able to isolate each one. I'll also add that of all of those forms, the 4 of them, only 1 to 2 of them are very active or potent, or actually hit the receptors in the central nervous system in a way that they produce the activity, the stimulatory effects that we're talking about. You should still be confused. You won't be confused for long. In addition, around the same time, Merck Pharmaceuticals, you've all heard of Merck Pharmaceuticals or the Merck Manual. It's a pharmaceutical company in Germany, well established, that's been around for a long time. They also isolated ephedrine, and they were able to get, in that case, they really isolated sort of 2 forms. They isolated the active form, which rapidly changed or racemized into the more inactive form, or the inactive form, okay? Should really be confused now, okay? Because ephedrine, or any molecule, any compound, it has one structure. So let me get into this for 1 second. We learned a little bit about neuroanatomy, central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. Let me get into this issue, and it's fun. There's a concept called chirality, okay? And it's an old Greek term or Latin term, I'm not sure which, and it means handedness, okay? And I'm going to pull up the image here on the computer, handedness. And in fact, the image is of ephedrine. So let me pull it up here. Okay, so let me share the screen here, and this will help. Let me see here. Okay, I'm sharing the screen. As you can see here, I got this right off of Wikipedia, and this is the structure of ephedrine. This in itself is interesting, but here's what I want you to know. And don't worry about too much of the structure, except know that where you see, for example, see the OH alcohol group here and the alcohol group here. When you see these broken lines, that means it's pointing away from you. And when you see the black solid lines up here, it's pointing towards you, okay? It's pointing towards you. In addition, you'll notice some letters here, R, and this one is S, and over here is S, and this one is R, okay? This is what's called chirality, okay? Or handedness, and it's the general concept is enantiomers, okay? And this is a concept that you will find in all of nature and all of science, physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, okay? It's pretty cool stuff, okay? But it plays a significant role in the world of pharmacology. These are mirror images of each other, okay? These are mirror images of each other. And only one, and if you notice, there's 4 places where you can have mirror images of each other. So when Nagai, the Japanese chemist, isolated this stuff, he discovered 4 different forms, depending on if this is pointing up or down, and this is pointing up or down. 4 different forms, okay? The German company Merck also figured out that there's an L-ephedrine, often referred to left, and a D-ephedrine. And the L-ephedrine rapidly decomposes to the D-ephedrine, which is inert, okay, and doesn't work. So depending on the mirror image that you're dealing with, the compound, the molecule may be active or may be inactive, okay? This is pretty cool stuff, and it really plays a big role in as far as applied stuff goes in pharmacology. But if you're a pure science kind of guy, it's really interesting, fascinating, mysterious, which brings to mind the concept of the clock and the clockmaker. Someone who's prone to that kind of magical thinking might, and those of you who know about the topic would know what I'm talking about. Someone who's prone to magical thinking and who's dying to prove the existence of a higher power. And again, I'm not saying if there is a higher power or not, might look at this and say, wow, this is really complex stuff, like a clock. So there must be a clockmaker. Wrong, okay? And in fact, the theoretical constructs of a clock and clockmaker are not theoretical at all. They're voodoo, because for you to be a theory, you have to have a testable hypothesis, and the clock and the clockmaker does not have a testable hypothesis, yet there's whole universities built on that nonsense. And you don't have to come up with nonsense to have a belief in a higher power. Let's get back to business. So there's a handedness to this. You just learned some more really cool science. Let's go back to not sharing our screen. Okay, all right. So keep that whole thing in mind. So there's that issue of getting the proper enantiomer that works and is stable, so you could potentially use, if you were considering this stuff as a drug, whether for fun or for therapeutic purposes. So Nagai, I guess he was not a great marketing guy or businessman or savvy enough to make money. He was just in it for, God forbid, but the right reasons, and didn't do much with it. He did pass it on to this other guy, which may have been his protege, his student, his colleague, I don't know. His name was Miuro. And Miuro went ahead. It's interesting. He sort of continued the study and the pharmacological properties of ephedrine. And it's interesting what he said about this stuff. And his comments were that this is too toxic, okay? Too toxic to use in any animal, meaning man. Let that be. 20, 30 years passed, okay? And 1910, 11, 12, 13, somewhere around there, two more Japanese scientists, Amatsu and his colleague Kubota. Kubota started re-investigating this stuff again, the ephedrine alkaloid, okay? And they came up with some surprising findings. We've moved forward in time, and science is moving forward. So is biological sciences. So is understanding of nervous system physiology, pharmacology, and the body, and so on. And they started investigating this stuff, and they came up with something really surprising. Okay, they realized that L-ephedrine, left-sided handedness ephedrine, was a sympathomimetic. Remember sympathomimetic? Autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, parasympathetic. Sympathetic is fight or flight, okay? Remember norepinephrine or noradrenaline, depending on which side of which continent you're from. Well, they found out that L-ephedrine, the molecule that's active, works as a sympathomimetic because it could raise blood pressure, it could increase the heart rate, and it opens up the airways. Remember, if you're in an emergency situation, you want to run like hell, you want your heart to beat strong, and you want it to get blood out to the peripheral circulation, and you want to be able to breathe. They realized that this stuff acts as a sympathomimetic and increases heart rate, increases blood pressure, increases contractility of the heart, and opens up the airway. And at that point, it occurred to them that they could potentially use this stuff as asthma medication, and they tried it, okay? They really tried it. They they created a formulation and sent it off to China, ephedrine-containing medicine, and it was called Asmatol. It was called Asmatol, and for the obvious reasons. And it didn't really go anywhere, surprisingly. Not much happened, okay? And so here we are. Not much has really happened, but great breakthroughs are happening in autonomic nervous system pharmacology or physiology. Now let's move forward. Let's move forward to the US in 1920s. So now we move to the 1920s, and two guys, Chen and Smith, were, I think, working at a Chinese university, Peking. And keep in mind, most of the publications, all of the publications on ephedrine had been either in Japanese, German, and Chinese up to that point. And these guys were working somewhat with the Chinese, and they were going to sort of explore the pharmacopoeia of Chinese medicine out there and shed some light on them. And I think they were at some pharmacy at some point, and a guy suggested that they might want to take a second look at Mao Hung. They did, and they were very pleasantly surprised. They came to some conclusions, cutting the story short, and they realized that ephedra, Mao Hung, and ephedrine, the active alkaloid, were very interesting because the active alkaloid did in fact and indeed act like adrenaline, which we already know, okay? The action, the half-life, the time was much longer than adrenaline, the catecholamine that we've already described, okay, which is a neurotransmitter. And we also said it's a hormone, okay? They realized that the chemical structures were about the same. That's interesting, right? And really, ephedrine belongs to what's called the sympathomimetic amines, catecholamines. Again, we discussed this. These are the neurotransmitters that we discussed, which are also hormones, okay? And they went ahead and published this stuff in a journal at that time. They published this stuff, and this was an important finding because up to that point, adrenaline was sort of the mainstay go-to thing for severe asthma attacks. Some drawbacks: very short half-life. It can only be injected. It's extremely unstable. And the stuff, because you have to give repeated doses for severe asthma attacks, this stuff can cause what's called bronchospasms. You start to get spasms down your airway, which makes it even more difficult to breathe. Two, it could send you off and you can get a heart attack because it pushes you into ventricular arrhythmias. Ventricular arrhythmias, part of the heart that starts to have funny beating, okay? Remember, adrenaline is also used in ACLS, advanced cardiac life support. Isn't it interesting how all of this stuff is connected? I mean, we're talking about the history of amphetamines and methamphetamines, and at the same time, it seems to be related to the discovery of pharmaceutical interventions for therapeutic clinical issues such as asthma, but we're also talking about advanced cardiac life support, hormones, and neurotransmission issues. Okay, so this was a huge discovery that these guys came to, okay? In all aspects of looking at this stuff, ephedrine is much more superior to adrenaline or epinephrine. And it can be given by mouth instead of shots. It has more prolonged effect, easy to carry around. And it's great. It's great for children, right? You don't have to give them shots of adrenaline, right? Remember in the movies, you see that stuff sucked in. Follow me. This is a great story, and it really gives you a great understanding of all things related. So at that point, Smith and Chen send a sample of this guy to a noted respiratory physician in the US to try some of it out. This is how you check things out back then. This was a study. And he tried it, I think, on children, asthmatics, and so forth, and noted that this stuff is amazing. It works great, far superior than having to use adrenaline. In fact, it stopped bronchospasms caused by adrenaline. What followed in the next 10, 15 years here, up to maybe 1930, was essentially a cocaine cowboy kind of a thing of people getting their hands on this stuff, doctors, pharmaceutical companies, and they just couldn't get enough. It was sort of a gold rush. In fact, some pharmaceutical companies even engaged in quite unethical behavior in trying to monopolize the market, which was eventually broken by the Indian subcontinent species. Remember, the two species that are active are in India and China. There's some in Americas, in Russia, in Greece, but the ones with the good stuff, with that ephedrine, with that very bulky amount of L-ephedrine versus S or the other two enantiomers, were in China and India. And this really was a supply and demand kind of thing. Think about it. It's interesting because it's limited because it's a natural substance. It's not like you can just bang away at this stuff in a laboratory and make tons and tons and tons of it, okay? It's valuable stuff. And so this brings us up quite a ways in the history of this stuff. Okay, so this stuff became the mainstay for asthma treatment. Supplies kept coming in, but some issues came up. Number one of the isomers of this stuff, L-pseudoephedrine, there were some concerns about the role it played when put into the body and how it affected the active form or the isomer that was active in bronchodilation, which is L-ephedrine. Okay, that was one issue. The second issue, remember, this is across national borders, China. There was a war with Japanese and the Chinese. Japanese invaded. The supply was in jeopardy. Eventually, the Indian supply was utilized. But at the same time, the Americans knew that they had to come up with a way to get this stuff going on their own, and there had been multiple laboratory attempts to isolate this stuff, but always too unstable, and you got too many side reactions, and you got too much of the inactive isomers, although you can call that pure ephedrine. Eventually, I think South Dakota or North Dakota, the college there was able, through a particular chemical reaction, synthesize the pure form without any problems, and this to a great extent solved the supply problem of ephedra mahung and active alkaloid with the L isomer that was needed. This really mitigated that issue at that point in the 30s. Next 20 years, a lot of development occurred, and autonomic or central nervous system pharmacology, delineating certain things. Some of they figured out some receptors, alpha and beta. You've heard of beta blockers for the heart to slow the heart down. So that we realized that some of the effects on the sympathetic nervous system were to slow things down. They realized that norepinephrine or noradrenaline was the primary neurotransmitter for the sympathetic nervous system. They discovered another catecholamine, isoparenteral, which proved to be a far superior bronchodilator than ephedrine. And some of the issues that really mattered here was, can you get something that gives you bronchodilation without the central nervous system effects? I won't go into all the details about that, but just so you know how things were coming up in the 40s and 50s, and we have skipped a lot, but I want you to get a kind of a good idea about how this stuff came about and what ended up happening. So as I said, in the 40s and 50s, the sales of this stuff peaked. And again, as usual, Chen and Schmidt had said, this stuff is not all that toxic, okay? With time and widespread use, and the availability of the pure form of ephedrine in compound tablets, they started to gain an appreciation for the potential side effects and toxicity of this stuff, and it was much more than they had supposed. Okay, number one, people that were taking it on a more long-term basis as a preventative measure became habituated to this stuff. Tolerance and physiological dependence, to say the least. There appeared to be acute overdoses of this stuff that had its main effect on the central nervous system and cardiovascular system, and there were fatalities, okay? And these guys were wrong, Chen and Smith, when they said that they had seen little evidence of withdrawal symptoms some years before all of this, okay? They were overly optimistic, and there's a lot of money on the line here, okay? People can become habituated to the central nervous system effects of this stuff, okay? And as a result, they needed to take more and more and more and more to feed their addiction. Remember, that's how addiction works. You know, one of the things is the receptors on the receiving end decrease, okay? So they were quite wrong about the initial discussion regarding the safety profile of this stuff. And in terms of habituation, let's use that term right now. You know, I prefer physiological dependence, but let's use that term. And patients were taking such large doses, they started to see, guess what? Anxiety, restlessness, insomnia, psychosis in some cases, urinary retention, which has to do with the alpha and beta receptors of sympathetic nervous system. They were having intermittent bouts of paranoid psychosis, okay? Suicidal, homicidal, and they had to be given, guess what? Same thing we give today, benzodiazepines intravenously to calm down their agitation. These symptoms by ephedrine very closely resembled amphetamine or methamphetamine crystal meth overdoses, okay? A lot of compounds associated with what we think of as illegal street drugs nowadays. Now, on the whole, you know, due to the amount, potency, and so forth, if you're dealing with just ephedrine by itself, the withdrawal symptoms are going to be much more minor than when you're dealing with methamphetamines of today and so forth. From 1950 onwards, the use of ephedrine began to decline. Other drugs, better drugs, more targeted and specific drugs started to emerge. The methylxanthines, theophylline, which actually is a very important component of caffeine. Steroids, they could be used in conjunction combination drugs with catecholamines, and sort of the search for better bronchodilators continued. Okay, so you're getting the idea. Let's move on to the 70s and 80s, where this stuff really was on a major decline and was not really used therapeutically by the pharmaceutical companies as better drugs had evolved. And as we discussed, because the understanding of the pharmacology and the autonomic nervous system physiology improved, you can have better targeted drugs, okay? But this stuff was still being imported into the Americas from China and India. China and India, where they had the most potent active form, okay? And even in many South American countries, still to this day, you can get this stuff over the counter. It is a medication supposedly for cough, asthma, difficulty breathing, bronchitis. It really came to be known as a cheap and a quick high, not too different from cocaine or amphetamines, and maybe even helping with sexual performance, muscle performance, and so forth. That last part, muscle performance, it also became sort of a natural over-the-counter thing for sportsmen of all types, especially in the professional world. And if it was in their pee, they can always talk about that they've had a cold or congestion or bronchitis and so forth. I guess one of the most famous examples of this is a footballer that, he was abusing ephedra, Diego Maradona. And, from then on, they started testing this stuff. But for us, I guess, in the early 2000s, a really well-known young baseball pitcher, Baltimore Orioles. I'm sorry, I'm not a big sports fan, so I don't know these guys. His name was Steve Bechler. I don't know the names of these guys. He actually suddenly collapsed on the training field. It was a hot summer day, I believe. And he died, okay? He died. And later on, his postmortem, they figured out there was ephedra in his body, and it was a nutritional supplement that this guy was using, okay? He had hyperthermia, that means a very high temperature, okay? That ended up in heart failure and renal failure, kidney failure, which is very normal in hypothermic situations. He had fluid in his brain that kind of blew up, and he did not, sadly, he didn't do well, okay? And there was a high concentration of ephedra in his blood, okay? And as far as the fever and the temperature going up, it has something to do probably with the resetting of the thermostat in your midbrain hypothalamic area, okay? Now, what this ended up doing, it created a lot of media attention on this stuff, and there was a lot of anger, and that it was perfectly legal to buy this plant over the counter as a nutritional supplement, and that was considered a major tragedy. And again, it takes something like this to bring light to issues such as this. A lot of athletic authorities banned ephedra, and the Food and Drug Administration really stopped being so relaxed on the rules on nutritional supplements. And they dramatically fell for several years, the sale of this stuff, okay? The Canadians and Mexicans also discovered that there was a lot of deaths secondary to ephedra, cardiac failure, hyperthermia, renal failure, both, okay? Or sometimes both or all three. They started to see that, and they don't exactly even know how many people died over the years with this stuff. But it really brought it to public light and attention, okay? Sort of the final tragic, weird saga of this story is, and we're gonna get more into it as we go on with other videos, is that in the last 20, 25 years, ephedrine sort of started to be used as a precursor to making methamphetamines, okay? Crystal meth, okay? There's a chemical reaction, one-stop process, and eventually they really tuned in and created much better methods for mass production. But whether it's your mom, pa, meth cook in the trailer in the back, or large production by big drug dealers, this was sort of the main ingredient that are easily available all over the Americas. And eventually, if you think about it, this really contributed to the major methamphetamine, crystal meth addiction in North America and really all over the world now, okay? And this stuff has extensive damage to the nervous system. It has a huge impact on the families that are involved with this stuff, the people that cook it. It's not a joke, okay? And unlike something like cocaine, okay, this stuff doesn't have to be transported long distances, right? We're making this stuff in the lab. We're using ephedra, right? The alkaloid from Mao Hung or ephedra to make methamphetamines. At least that's how it was for a while. It's changed, and I'll get into that in the next couple of videos, okay? The price of methamphetamines on the streets dropped to nothing, made it more accessible to the poor and rich alike, okay? Whereas cocaine is quite expensive. The American and Mexican governments eventually tried to put some chokeholds on selling this stuff, at least in the over-the-counter medication of Sudafed. You know that drug Sudafed? You can't just go and buy 50 packs of Sudafed. It's really no longer legal to do something like that. And pharmacies are quite regulated in selling this traditional over-the-counter medication, okay? So what I'm hoping at this point, what you got out of this is a very fascinating history with an interplay of nature, science, okay, big pharma, money, substance abuse, epidemic addictions, and how these worlds all coalesced in a very short period of time, 30, 40, 50 years. In addition to that, it also sprung forth an era of really important scientific discovery in pharmacology and physiology, and it brought us up to recent history. So take a look at this, meditate on it. In the next video, more than likely, hopefully, I'm going to talk about the new methamphetamines and what's different than the use of ephedra as a precursor substance, and we're going to keep moving forward from there. I hope you liked this video. This one was a little bit long. Please click the like and subscribe button. Please start a conversation below if you have anything to add, or if I goofed up on anything, messed anything up, any information you have. I love it. We can generate a discussion. And please don't forget our Patreon, as this is solely supported by us. Have a great day. See you soon.